Now we're going to shift gears, and I'd like to invite up to the stage three experts in creating opportunities for rich and nuanced dialogue, which actually still exists today. And I think they'll be reflecting a broad range of viewpoints in a pretty highly politicized environment that we find ourselves in today. First, I'd like to welcome Joshua Johnson, who's host of the popular new radio program 1A, produced right here in Washington at radio station WAMU, and we're also joined by JJ Yor, who's here, station manager. Thank you, Joshua, for coming. I moved to the Bay Area about 5 years ago, and I am very happy that Joshua's program is now on KQED. It's on at 11 o'clock at night, which I'm lobbying them to put on at 3 p.m. So if any of you are in the Bay Area, lobby them as well. It's a terrific program, and he understands Washington after not being here a very long time. Joining Joshua will be Jaime-Alexis Fowler. I'd like to welcome Jamie to the stage. Jamie is Deputy Director of Common Sense News, which is a place where parents of all political persuasions seek guidance on media and entertainment choices that might be appropriate for their children. And also participating in the discussion will be Charlie Sykes, noted conservative author and veteran radio host. And with that, I'll turn it over to a real professional. Joshua, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Charlie. Welcome. Hi, everybody. First key to sparking good civic conversations is energy. Hi, everybody. Good, thank you. That's a lot better. This is a lot easier. I don't get this on the radio. It's just like me in the control room, and I have to provide my own energy while they're looking at each other going, can we play that cut right over here? Where are we going exactly? When is lunch? So thank you for giving us some energy to have this conversation. I don't know if I would consider myself an expert. I just happen to have a little more experience, but the three of us, Jaime-Alexis, Charlie, and I, are eager to share our experiences with you. Thank you for hosting us, and thank you for showing that these kind of conversations matter to you and to the communities that you serve. The way we'd like to do this is just to kind of share what we do about what we do and the three different perspectives that we come from. I'll get to your questions as quickly as possible. I don't know if we want to have people use a mic because we're streaming this on the web, or how you want to do questions. So we'll have a mic that goes through the audience, and someone will Phil Donahue, Oprah Winfrey over to you to give you the mic, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And we will try to make as much time as possible for your questions. We have about 52 minutes to get in your conversation, but I work in radio. I can do a lot in 52 minutes. I think what I'd like to do is start with the two of you and talk a little bit about your approaches to civic dialogue. Then I'll talk about what we do on 1A, and we'll kick it back and forth up here for a little while. We'll go to your questions, and we'll just kind of see where it goes. Does that work? Excellent. Jaime-Alexis, why don't you start? In terms of the way that you approach civic dialogue and what the title of this session calls quality dialogue, what does that look like to you? How do you make it happen, and how do you know when you've got it? Charlie, I'll ask you to answer the same question in just a minute. But Jaime-Alexis, what about you? What are you looking for? How do you bring it about? And how do you know it when you got it?
So for those of you who don't know, Common Sense, I don't know how many people in here are parents and use Common Sense, but Common Sense reaches about 60 million parents and educators across the United States. And so a big piece of what we do is to provide resources and information to those parents and educators to have these informed discussions. And we do that in a way that approaches parents and caretakers in kids' lives in a really empathetic way, that they're trying to figure something out, that they're trying to understand how to engage with their kids or the families or the people in their lives around decisions related to media and technology. And so our role is really to, Jim, our CEO, jokingly calls it the nutritional labeling of media. So media is all around us, and we are inundated with information, and that drives our conversation. So if we don't have the tools and resources to understand that media, how do we have that conversation, and how do we be informed citizens? So in particular, last year, we looked at that and said, 25%, 24% of the US population is under the age of 18, and there's a huge gap in the conversation that's happening around kids. And a big piece of that is that news media is not covering the issues that relate to kids. So we launched Common Sense News, which is delving into deep reporting about issues related to kids and families across the United States. And our belief is that if you don't have, and I think this is a thread in the conversations this morning, if you don't see what's unseen, if you're not having that information at your fingertips, you're not able to have that conversation. So that's where I'm coming from in this conversation.
Could I just ask you to clarify,
Sure.
in terms of what Common Sense News does, is what you're looking to do bringing the news of the day to young people? Is it in an age-appropriate way, or to engage with the conversations young people are already having about current events, or what's your focus?
Our focus is really on the programs and policies that touch on kids' lives and reporting on that, and not following the daily news cycle, but doing it from a really deep way. So we are focused more on the investigative side and looking into what's not being covered. So for instance, we have an investigative reporter who is one of the first in recent memory who's gotten access to the juvenile courts in Mississippi. That's an area that people do not see. So in terms of some of the conversations this morning, when you're not seeing what's happening with a young 17-year-old in a court in Mississippi, how do you have a conversation about that? How do you change we have the Galt decision that ensures every young person has a right to defense. But if you don't see what's happening in that courtroom, if you don't know what's happening with that individual, you can't make any evaluation of that policy or the programs associated with it. So our perspective is really shining a light on stories that aren't being told, and we see this reflected in research. In March, we released a new study around how kids see the news and are impacted by the news, and overwhelmingly kids say 10 to 18, they don't see themselves reflected in the news doesn't understand them, they don't know, why news covers certain issues related to kids. And so I think for those conversations that we've had around trust in media, that distrust starts early. So if you start shifting that and saying, yes, these are the issues that touch on kids' lives and we're covering them, it can change that conversation too.
And how do you know when you struck the right tone in the dialogue? What does that look like, sound like when Common Sense News hits it right on the head?
I wish I could say. We just launched, so
well, what is your aspiration?
So our aspiration would be, we had a piece earlier this year in the LA Times that was looking at one woman's story to reunite with her kids. It was a 1-year investigative piece, and that had the longest engagement time of any readers on the LA Times site for that period that it was posted at the first couple of days. And it really drove some different conversations, not just in the LA region, but across California. And we had members of the community, we had congressional representatives calling and saying, we want to change the way that this is structured. So for us, getting those calls and getting those changes, but we also, thinking about the Harkin conversation, we did a survey across the Common Sense website to see what issues parents thought were coming up in their lives in 2017. And so we've actually structured our reporting in relation to some of those issues. So we were surprised to see that a lot of parents were interested in, what does climate change mean for my family? They see it covered in the news, but they don't see it in terms of how it's actually going to touch on the kids, on their decisions that they're making in their families' lives.
Charlie Sykes, what about you? What kind of dialogue are you aiming for? How do you go about bringing it together, and how do you know when you hit it?
Well, let me go back a little bit, because I don't want to be the person with the darker vision, but I want to start off by saying that I think I got involved with WNYC after I wrote a piece that basically said everything that's happening with political polarization and the news media that is bad is about to get worse. The alternative reality silos that we have created are going to be self-reinforcing, and they're going to be growing.
But he doesn't want to be the dark one.
Right, okay, so, well, I'll get to the positive thing. Yes. I will try to get to the positive thing. It's important to understand how the situation is, in fact, however bad you think it is, it's probably worse. In terms of, well, I mean, having gone through 2016, we kind of know this, right? So, but in terms of the way in which Americans are separating themselves, in which they're not engaging in that quality dialogue, in which they are not speaking to one another, they don't live with one another. I mean, geographically, we've now begun to sort ourselves out. We have created intellectual ghettos on the right and the left. You can live in social media universes that have their own facts, their own narratives, their own villains, their own. So we can live in an era, and I think that we're sort of living through this right now, where you can have some of the greatest journalism, some of the greatest analysis of public affairs, but it does not penetrate to a large segment of the population. So this is a crisis. I, as a student of history, always try to go back to, well, is this like this? Is this like when we all had partisan newspapers? Is this like, this era of American or world history? And I think that because of the new technology and social media and the way it's been weaponized, that we are in a completely unprecedented era right now. And to get slightly even darker, if that's at all possible, it's not simply that we have echo chambers, bubbles, whatever analogy you like to use. I use the alternative reality silos where hermetically sealed, but we also live in a post-factual, post-truth political environment. In part because I think we have a lot of people who have lost their interest or their ability in making those critical distinctions. So, to your question of the quality dialogue, right around the time that I was writing some of these really dark things about how we'd gotten to where we are and how what a challenge this is. And by the way, this is not a challenge to the media. This is a challenge to democracy. A lot of things that we take for granted, I think, are being challenged here. So I get a call from WAMU and said, okay, so you're this right-wing talk show host from Wisconsin. How would you like to host a public radio show for the first 100 days of the Trump administration where you talk across political divides and try to have the kind of discussion that you're having? And I thought, that's the most bizarre idea I've ever heard. I mean, really, when you think about it. So that made it intriguing to me to think that this was, in fact, possible.
Did you think you were being punked? Were you like, did you want to know if it was a prank call? Or?
Right, I said, have you Googled me? No, and on my very first show, I think I opened the show by saying, I am a stranger in a strange land. And that was true in so many ways. But it was a very interesting experience for me to realize, first of all, the role that public radio can play in perhaps facilitating that dialogue. I have to admit, I was amazed at how many Trump supporters and who were listening to the I think 170 affiliates that we had, and the kinds of discussions that we were able to have. I won't say that in 14 weeks I solved the riddle of how to get to that, but I will say that it was a very interesting experience to me to begin to have a substantive, issue-based discussion in which you have mutual respect. And so a couple of things that I look for is, are you having this debate without ad hominem attacks? Are you actually able to show respect for the other premise? But the one thing that I think right near the end of the run of Indivisible that I wish I'd had more time to develop, given the fact that this polarization is so extreme, it is not exaggerated. It's in fact more intense than, this is not something that is created by talking heads. That if you can ever get people, this will sound silly I suppose, but if you get people talking to people as opposed to as partisans, if you can get people, take out the political binary choice, because our politics is so binary, where there's no give. If you get people talking about things of mutual interest, like their actual lives and things, their communities and things that they're concerned about, their child's education, caring for an elderly parent, it is amazing that perhaps we're not that divided.
I don't think that sounds silly at all.
No, and also I have to say that having done this in a number of different media, I don't know that anyone else has the capability of doing this. But by the way, it's not easy. I would not in any way want to sit here and say that I'm an expert in how to make this happen, because I don't think anyone knows in this environment, this toxic environment, which will get more toxic, how to make that happen. But I think some of us, I think you have many of the possible resources to make it happen.
Well, I think by way of talking about what we do at 1A, I agree with you that that there is a great deal of toxicity in the environment. There certainly is the potential for it to get worse. I agree that there are really no experts, except me. That's why I'm moderating. But although we're far, far, far from experts for a brand new program that is less than a year old, we're literally still learning how to walk on this program. But I think what we've seen, for my experience anyway, is that there, a lot of what you said, Charlie, is exactly what we're trying to do at 1A. Not the least of which is treating people like people and not parties. Right. And not like factions or demographics or descriptors, but that we treat you like you. That you are this singular person who brings all kinds of stakes to a conversation, who has motivations in a conversation, who is a character in the narrative of this show that we're trying to do. We're trying to do it with a much greater eye towards storytelling. Right. What is the story we're trying to tell? what are the opposites that are in conflict? What is this goal in the middle, and what's at stake for each of you? So that way, it's not, oh, those conservatives, oh, those liberals. No, you, this person, who may describe yourself in all these different ways, but you are still you. And if we don't speak to you about what's going on with you, we'll never hear that story. I think the main thing that we tried to do in 1A as the successor program to the Diane Rehm Show, not the replacement, because no one replaces Diane Rehm, but the successor to the Diane Rehm Show, is figure out what it was that made the Diane Rehm Show successful and copy the core elements of that into a format that was built for 2017. And Diane and I have a great deal in common. We're both very devoted to civic dialogue. We're deeply curious about the world. We are deathly allergic to double talk. And we believe that public radio is a good forum to have these conversations, and has been basically since its inception. That it's been a good forum for this for decades, and it's always aspired to be that. So we try to create a space that is not just civil, but welcoming. We know that there are lots of Americans who, as both Jaime-Alexis and Charlie articulated, are kind of tired of the pace of news, who want to have a little bit more connection and a little bit less pugilism on a day-to-day basis. We know that there are people who are tired of engaging with clenched fists and sharp elbows, so we became a space about open arms. So we actively try to engage people across what are usually battle lines and make it clear that we are not battling for this hour. Our host does not like fighting. If you try to fight during the show, he's gonna make your life painful. So as long as we can focus on the issues and on having a smart conversation, we'll be fine. Doesn't mean everybody has to agree, because it can still be, intense, but it needs to be intentional, not just intense. I take a lot of what I do as an interviewer from my very broad background. My other degree is in theater, as will become, I know, it's very apparent now. And I also was, before I kind of doubled down on journalism and broadcasting, I was on track to be a doctor, because I was always interested in the sciences. Science teaches us that everything that creates light creates at least a little bit of heat, but not everything that creates heat creates light. So it is with conversation. There are many conversations that are very intense and emotional and fiery, and they're very heated, but they seldom illuminate. However, there are also conversations that are so busy dealing with the geopolitical and socioeconomic ramifications of a situation that they suck all the warmth out of the room, and they're cold. Those are both bad. I believe our responsibility is to be more light than heat, but not to be all light and no heat. Because the issues that we're talking about are human stories. People are angry for a reason. People are scared for good reasons. People are pissed off, and they're taking to the streets, and they're yelling at town halls, and they're shouting angry questions in committee meetings, and they're calling, and they're organizing, and they're inveighing, and they're voting, and they're protesting, and they're speaking up, and they're giving money, and they're fighting back for reasons that are human. And we shouldn't impute shame on people for feeling what they feel. We do, however, have a responsibility to make sense of what they're feeling. But we can't do that if we keep their feelings out. So we find ways to frame topics about the issues that are underlying, and find ways to talk about them through the eyes of the people who are affected. So in this way, we're still telling a good story. Because at the end of the day, we understand human life through story, right? Well, what happened? Well, first of all, we're narrative. Humans are narrative. We try, I think, too hard sometimes to be topical, and we become cold. We become Borg-like. And as much as I worry about the screaming and yelling and shouting and cussing and fussing on cable news, which is a weird funhouse image of reality, I also worry that we're afraid of having that conversation, and we're afraid of getting our hands dirty. So we try to find people of goodwill and good conscience who are willing to say, I really disagree with you, but we have to discuss this. So let's just talk about this. And then once we do that, the rest becomes much easier. we find that tools like Harken, which we do use on 1A, not nearly enough. I think we need to use Harken even more than we use it because it's never failed us, ever. I think tools like Harken, or even being active on social media, opening the phones when we choose to open the phones, those are all useful, but ultimately it starts with having a sense of narrative, understanding that these are stories we need to tell well, with an eye toward the craft of storytelling and be compelling. I think it means we have to be compassionate and allow for a space where people can be treated with decency and with respect, where I enforce that you are not going to speak to my guests in that way, and we set that up before we book somebody so I don't have to smack anybody on the air. And then we do our best to open it up to the rest of the country so that people can bring their views and their questions and their thoughts and their emotions to it, and just trust that we're going to let them be who they are and say what they feel without trying to suck the energy out of the room. That if you spend an hour with us, you will have had sense made of these issues, you'll have had a great conversation, it'll be fun, it'll be interesting, it'll be unexpected, and you will have a great reason to say to your friend, what do you mean you didn't listen to 1A today? Oh, well, go back and listen and then we'll talk. That's the goal, is to make it so people say, go back and listen and then we'll talk, so that we can be part of the necessary connective tissue of the conversations we have with other people, and that we can model those conversations. Like, I don't know how to talk to you about this because you think this and I think that, and if we start talking again, I'm just gonna punch you in the throat. And I don't wanna do that to you, but they did it on 1A, so listen to 1A first and then we'll talk. That's the goal, that we become an indispensable part of the conversation and a model for what the conversation should sound like when it's done right. That's the goal. Having said all of that idealistic stuff, the panel is about cutting through the noise. And maybe we go back to the Lord of Darkness for a moment about where the noise is coming from and what we do about it. It seems to be coming from everywhere. You certainly believe that it's going to get darker potentially. Where do you see the most potential for cutting through the noise? Is there a chink in the armor? Is there a weak spot in terms of all of this noise that's around? Is there something that people who are trying to cut through the noise can attack first?
Well, that's good. That is a good question, because I think that we live in an age right now where the most difficult things for anybody who's a political activist to say would be, I might have been wrong about that. Or the other side might have had a pretty good argument or a good point. Part of this is and it's an overused term now, but it's important, is the tribalism of our culture. That a lot of the debates now take place between intense tribes that aren't bound together by necessarily any specific principle, but it's the power of tribal loyalty. I don't want to get too deep into that. But how do you attack it? Well, I think at some point I keep waiting for, will there be a breaking point? Will there be an exhaustion from the kind of the talking heads, the ranting and the raving that goes back and forth? And by the way, since I do that also, I should disclose that. I do think that there's a hunger out there for, and I don't know necessarily how to quantify it, but I think there's a big hunger among center-right, center-left Americans to hear an intelligent discussion, to figure out what exactly is going on, what do I believe, what are the things that are, of course, of the most salience. The problem is that particularly in the media, those are not the voices that you hear. On the extremes, those are the ones. It is the far right and the far left, I think, that often will drive the discussion. And unfortunately, all of the incentives in the media tend to reward those voices, the loudest, the most bombastic, the most reckless. So the question is, how do you get back? How do you get back what's broken? How do you get back, the trusted referees of truth? How do you get back that sense of we can have these kinds of intelligent discussions, and what is the market for them? And I'm not sure what the market for them outside of public public venues are. But I will say this, I thought what you said about telling stories and having people engage as people, I mean, that I think is a profound insight. Also, not to misuse the term, but to make it very clear that when you engage in the discussion, it's going to be relatively safe, that it's not going to be, it's not the Thunderdome. One of the things that happened, and I mean, I watched this, you know, in Wisconsin, as everyone polarized, as everybody went back into their tribal political corners, it became, you know, all of that became more intense. I mean, I can list a large, you know, long list of folks who would never go on any public radio show because they perceive that public radio is the left's version of what Rush Limbaugh is on the right. It's not true, but that's the image. And it got to the point where they did not think this was a venue. So when I went on WNYC, I mean, I spent a lot of my time off the air, you know, talking to people you know, who were saying, well, how could you possibly be on public radio? You're a turncoat, you're a Judas, you're a Benedict Arnold, you know, how could you have gone to the dark side? You know, that this is the dark side. I said, well, you can't complain about media, and then when they have people with different points of view on, complain about that as well. But this is something to keep in mind, that if you want to broaden the audience and to broaden the participation, you're going to have to do what you were talking about, Joshua, making it clear that participation is not a ticket to humiliation.
Jaime-Alexis, what do you think? Where is the opportunity greatest, maybe even easiest, to begin cutting through some of that noise and improving the quality of the dialogue? And just before you answer, after Jamie answers, I'd like to go to some of you. If you have any good questions, we'll start moving the mic around. Jaime-Alexis?
I think one of the more interesting areas are around issue-specific newsrooms that draw people around an issue. I mean, I think, obviously, I'm a huge fan of public media and feel really strongly about the quality of the programming, and my son, who's 21 months old, gets to hear all of their voices every day. But I think when you look at entities like the Marshall Project, which is, you know, doing really phenomenal reporting, and, you know, it's bringing people together. I think issue-specific newsrooms are bringing people together around issues to help inform and draw people who may not get together at other points, or may find that particular other brands, whether it's public media or CBS or Fox or whatever, don't necessarily either cover the issues they care about or might fall into a different category. I think there's an opportunity there, and I think that, for me, and what we're doing at Common Sense News is intriguing. I mean, we see that we've covered an issue recently, and we got feedback from both sides. You know, we had a parent who wrote us and said, oh my gosh, I can't believe you covered this. It was so far on the left. And we had a parent who wrote in and said, this was so far on the right. And we were like, okay, it was success. You know, and I think, you know, as an organization, holistically, that touches parents and educators across all 50 states, we see really fascinating snippets of feedback. We posted a statement after the election trying to thread the needle of, you know, we're an organization that stands up and says how to be a good digital citizen, that talks about, you know, the importance of not doing cyberbullying, you know, the badness of cyberbullying, and then, okay, look who's in the White House. But so many of our constituency are parents who, you know, maybe voted for Trump. And so we released that statement, and we had one of the biggest pieces of content engagement we've had as an organization, with comments all, you know, from all different sides. And I think in some ways that it's not necessarily a conversation to have comments in relation to an article, but you could see a dialogue and people responding to one another. And I think probably parents seeing different perspectives that they hadn't seen before. So that was, I think, issue-specific newsrooms could be a way to start that conversation and bring people in from different sides. I think, as you were saying, the modeling of that conversation is really important as well. So I see some hope, but, you know, I also grew up in Texas, and I go home regularly to San Antonio and have very different conversations with my family there than in San Francisco. So
I would imagine so. Let's take a few questions. Before you ask your question, I have just one rule for whenever I moderate and take questions. And my one rule is be generous with your questions. There are a lot of people in this room who all have insights to share, would like to share them in the time we have. And the person next to you who's waiting for the mic might have something to share that is just as valid as what you've been dying to say since we took the stage. The more generous you are with the time you take for your question, the more we can all learn from one another. So please, whatever you ask, be generous with the time that you take to ask it. Cool? Question number one. Please do introduce yourself and then tell us what's on your mind.
I'm Jeff Jarvis from City University of New York, Graduate School of Journalism. Charlie, question for you. I believe, and I'm a liberal journalist, but I believe a great need in American media right now is to have a responsible, fact-based, conservative worldview news outlet. The Telegraph to the Guardian we don't have here. So dream for a moment. Yeah. And also, by the way, Fox News just announced that they're dropping Fair and Balanced. So they're weakened. It's the time to compete. Dream for me for a minute. What would a responsible, great, but conservative worldview news outlet look like in your view?
Before you answer, Charlie, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, feel free to ask questions, I should have mentioned this, to any of the three of us. If you have a question about 1A or WAMU, I'll be happy to answer. Go ahead, Charlie.
Well, first of all, I agree with the premise of your premise completely. In fact, I was on a panel last week here in Washington, and I said, look, you know, the problem of fake news and the bizarre alternative reality stuff on the right, the liberal media and the mainstream media is not going to be able to fix that. It's going to have to be conservatives who are going to have to, throw the flag. In fact, after this, I'm going to go and spend some time talking about what conservatives should do about Alex Jones and people like that. And it will be, I'm just parenthetically, one of the great failures of, I think, the conservative media and the conservative movement was the failure to call out voices like Alex Jones, to police our own borders. Because especially in an alternative reality universe, no one's going to listen to anything, that's outside the silo. If I say to you, well, the Washington Post says that Alex Jones is a complete nut job, well, that's the Washington Post. If you have a trusted source. So in answer to your question, I think having a fact-based, reliable, credible, conservative media is absolutely essential. So is it going to be one thing, or is it going to be multiple outlets? Because we don't live in a world where there's one, and I'm old enough to be nostalgic for when William F. Buckley Jr. used National Review to excommunicate the John Birchers. Nothing like that exists today. Nobody can basically say, you know what, no one in polite society should deal with X, Y, and Z because these people are bigots or they're xenophobes or they're complete nut jobs. We just don't have those gatekeepers anymore. But what has to happen is the willingness of leading voices. And there are magazines, I'm affiliated with at least one of them, with several of them, that need to do that. But they also have to have the guts to be able to break with the tribe. This is the hardest thing. I've experienced this, is that people think that the role of conservative media is simply to attack the left. And they feel that there's like a betrayal where it's irrelevant if we spend time basically saying, and by the way, the president was not born in Kenya. No, this is not true over here. But I think we've paid a price for that failure. I do think that to the extent that we can encourage and build up a responsible, fact-based conservative media, the dividends would be amazing, would be important, because that's the only way you're going to get folks going, yes,
Let me, as we're going for the next question, did anybody else have another one? While we're coming to my boss, let me just add on to Professor Jarvis's question for a moment.
Yeah.
Does the market for conservative media of the type that Professor Jarvis described exist? You have a lot of outlets. I mean, we may not like what Alex Jones and InfoWars do, but InfoWars has millions of followers.
Right.
And there are plenty of critics. There's plenty of excellent journalism that goes on, say, at Fox News. There are plenty of journalists at Fox News who are straight ahead. They're fantastic. But that kind of red meat conservative talk is what makes them billions of dollars a year. And if people really felt the way the professor felt, Fox News would not be the #1 network on cable. Does the market even want that?
That's the key question. I would break it into print and broadcast. Broadcast, there's no market for it right now. I don't see it. Print, I think that there is. But the problem is that unless you have leading talk show hosts, unless you have Fox basically turning the fire on the bad actors on their side, it won't have the impact. So, but that is interesting. Is there a market for that? if there was a market for that, you'd see it.
Yes.
So, JJ, you're from WAMU here in Washington. And Charlie, sorry to keep putting you in the spotlight on this, but I wonder, I've almost got a flip side of Jeff's question, which is after you spent 100 days behind enemy lines, do you have anything that you took from that you think would be a good message for people in public media to inform how we reach a broader audience and how we achieve greater credibility among people who think of us as all sort of woolly-headed liberals?
Well, first of all, I have to say the tremendous respect I had working with my colleagues at WNYC. I mean, obviously, I was the stranger in the strange place, and I was very, very impressed by the professionalism, by the skill, and by how supportive they were. The one thing I would point out is that I didn't burn down the building to have people of different points of view in there. I think a lot of it is the perception. I mean, I know how conservatives look at public radio, and I know that I know the efforts that have been made to be fair. The question is, people have to listen. They have to break through that. But I think when you talk about diversity, which is important, the diversity of point of view needs to be there. And I think that when people are driving around and they turn it on, they go, whoa, there's George Will. There's somebody that I wasn't expecting to hear on public radio, saying these things. Then we'll get to that sense of this is where we're going to hear some interesting things. We're going to hear the kinds of voices that we might listen to. I mean, you're not going to get the hardcore Alex Jones fan. That's not going to happen. But trust me, there's a large number of center-right folks who are not buying into this current political culture. And right now, they are orphans. They're orphans politically, and they're orphans in the media. And so there is a moment of opportunity.
You know what, I wish we could, and as we're moving the mic, who's got the next question? As we're moving the mic for the next question, we'll get to you in just a minute, ma'am. But I wish sometimes we could take pictures of the guests that we have on 1A after the show. Because often we'll have like a guest on the left and the guest on the right, and then a reporter who's kind of calling balls and strikes in the middle. And as soon as the show's over, they go, "Hey, it was great to see you. Oh, how you been? Are you going to make it to Peter's party? That was a really good point you made. I wrote that down. So do you need a ride? I'm going to take a lift downtown to the White House. Do you want to come with?" And it's like these people merge in traffic very elegantly with one another. It's not just demolition derby all day. And I wish we had better ways of depicting that. The demolition derby you see on cable news is not reality. It's real, but it's not the reality of Washington. There are plenty of people on both sides who interface just perfectly, and they have a little bit more of a value. They put a little more value in one another than cable news might suggest. Yes. There we go.
Is this on? There we go.
It is not.
Hi, my name is Tawana Hines, and I'm with And Action, and we use pop culture as our entry point. So this idea that the issue is actually the leading character in the TV show or film, and then connect nonprofits who are working on that. And one of the things that we found since we launched just last year is that the stigma for pop culture is so strong, right? So when you were saying something like, oh, well, the Washington Post says this, and then people may tune out. Or if you say, I read on Breitbart the other day this, then the other site turns out. And you pose a really good question of like, how do we actually get to these untapped people, middle, center, right, whatever we use to describe the people who are not being spoken to, but are watching television shows, are listening to music, are going to the theater and doing these other things where those messages are still being disseminated. How do we kind of do something to move the stigma needle on that? And that
I just want to make sure I fully
Sure.
you mean move the stigma needle on certain news and information sources? Is that what you're referring to?
the fact that news and information, like that word information, cuts out a lot of the pop culture aspects. And so we're not talking about music or theater or film or television.
Jaime-Alexis, since you deal with younger people and younger people's issues, could you address that?
Sure. Well, I think my first question is, you were raising that as sort of like, does that stigma need to be removed? I mean, that type of media has so much influence that is there, I mean, I guess I would put it back to you and say, like, what drives that question in terms of taking away the stigma? Because I think some of us would argue, and certainly at Common Sense, we see this all the time. I mean, the influx and impact of that media is so huge that it may not be cited in the Washington Post, but like, who cares? I mean, right? Because it's driving at people 24/7 in a very different way, and is, I think, perceived really differently. And certainly, you know, before I was at Common Sense, I worked with an organization that was trying to change the conversation around abortion. And a big way in which we came about that was not through doing work with media, news media, but through working with TV shows and trying to change the way in which abortion was depicted on air to try to change that conversation and depict it in a different way. So I guess I would throw it back to you and say, like, why remove the stigma, or what stigma is there?
Ooh, I'll answer both of those questions. I like this. Ooh, so one, why remove the stigma? And two, why is the stigma there? I think both of those are that, like, going back to the point that we've all talked about, like this amazing journalism, right? When we talk about media and information and the types of stories that are getting out there and the work that people in this room and beyond, your grantees and all of these different organizations are doing, right? It's like breaking through to some degree, reaching these youth, reaching like all of these places where pop culture does actually reach. How do we get those stories that are in media to kind of work more with that? So it's not so much about stigma for stigma's sake, but really, hey, there's all this impact over here. There's all this great information over here. How can we build more linkages between those two?
Can I take a stab at answering that?
Sure.
I think, and this speaks to my bias about the way that this kind of work should be done, but I think that the answer to your question may be built into the question in terms of your reference to these great stories. I think often we don't do very well at telling stories. We're great at saying, there is a very important issue that you should be thoroughly well acquainted with. And we start talking about this very important issue, as opposed to telling a story. You know, I think we have to be much more cognizant of the first sentence in the story, because that's what's going to give you permission to hear the second. I think we have to be much more cognizant about the first shot in the documentary. I don't care about the 60-minute documentary. I want the first 6 seconds to hook me. Is your best tape at the top? Is your best question at the beginning of the first segment? Don't hide the good stuff. Hit me. There's too much competition out there. We can't just be interesting. We have to be compelling. We have to make people listen. And I think often what pop culture does a better job of is storytelling. You know, we want people to talk about the prison pipeline and the way that the criminal justice system deals with young black men. Spike did an entire documentary with Jay-Z about Khalif Browder, which was unbelievable. You know, we want young people to talk about teenage depression and suicide, but Paramount Television put 13 Reasons Why on Netflix. And as whatever you think about 13 Reasons Why, it started the conversation. I just don't think we do a good enough job of caring about the craft of storytelling as much as pop culture does. It's our responsibility to hook people. It's not your responsibility to be hooked. We are the professional storytellers. And I think sometimes we just need to look at our stories and say, this is boring. This isn't interesting. Where's the hook? What's at stake? So what? We don't ask the so what question enough. Maybe we just need to be better storytellers. I agree with you that not enough impact is put on some of these news sources, but I'm grateful that some news sources are really taking a hard look at the way they do narrative, story, multimedia, engagement, curating stories even with tools like Harken, or just with having conversations with their audiences, being more engaged to make sure that we're being the best communicators that we can be. Who's got the mic?
That's good.
Yes. Oh. Yes, sir.
Trying to remember, Dave, Kansas, Minnesota Public Radio, American Public Media. Charlie, it was good to work with you on Indivisible. Joshua, you're becoming very popular in the heartland. They enjoyed your brisk discussion about Julius Caesar yesterday.
Yeah.
My question is to Jaime-Alexis. We've heard Charlie and Joshua and also Jeff a little bit talk about the opportunity to grab more audience and what public radio's opportunity. You grew up in Texas. You live in the Bay Area, I believe, now. So you've been listening to these people talk, mostly guys, I think. What do you think public radio can do? What's the opportunity? What advice would you give the two gentlemen to your right, and to J.J. Orr and to myself, that would say, here are 3 things I think you should really think about that you're not thinking about if you really want to capture greater audience or keep the big audience, for instance, that J.J. yours captured at WAMU. And I want you to be really blunt.
I'm really good at speaking truth to power in a lot of ways. So I would say, one, I would say as someone who thinks a lot about my own experience growing up in Texas, and for those of you who haven't read Joan Williams' article about sort of the working class white Americans who voted for Trump, she and I were talking about this recently because that's very much my experience in a lot of ways. I would say, reflecting more of those stories, and it's amazing to me now being in the Bay Area how little of those stories are reflected in what I see and perceive in San Francisco. And and I've talked to people at the San Francisco Chronicle and others about this, and you just don't see different types of voices. You don't see different perspectives. Some of it's storytelling, and I think obviously NPR and public media do a fantastic job of that. But from a local perspective, you don't see that in San Francisco. So I think that's really, really important. I would say, based on some of the research that we've seen, and not just Common Sense, but Pew and I think Knight and others who've done, kids do not see themselves reflected in news. And I think if you look at this population of young Americans who are growing up, and if we want to think about civic engagement going forward, we have to tap into them as an audience, and we have to reflect them not just in pop culture, but in the news media and the coverage of them. So that means really compelling storytelling about issues that affect their lives. And I think it was something like 36 minutes on the evening news in the last election cycle were spent talking about policy at all. And in 2008, it was
whole year.
It was for the whole year, for all of 2016. Not a single minute of that touched on issues related to kids, and not even education. So you're seeing a whole population grow up without seeing themselves reflected in the news media, and when they are, it's in a really scary way. It's it's incarceration, it's violence, it's otherwise. You're not seeing positive role modeling stories out there or solutions around what could change. So I think tapping into that audience is huge. The third one, I don't know. Maybe I would land with two. I don't know if I have a third.
Can I make just one really brief comment? Because since I started doing some public radio stuff, I've been encouraging some of my friends, just to try it, especially because these are news junkies. And talk about a great time to be in public broadcast. In public affairs broadcasting, given the pace of news. And the response that I have gotten from people, and many of these are converts, short term, or samplers, is always been the same. I feel smarter after I've listened to public radio. And then when they switch back to the news talk stations, they have the sense of, oh my God, it sounds so dumb. Because you expect, you adjust your standards to what what you think. So you could surprise a lot of people, I think, in this particular era, get them to sample, it's not what they think it is, and then when they compare going back to the other stuff, it will make you look awfully good.
I call it the NPR epiphany.
Yeah.
When they finally have their epiphany, like, finally, it's been here this whole time. Why
Right.
didn't I know this sooner?
Well,
Next question.
yes.
Exactly. Next question. We've got a few more minutes, and I think at least a few of us will still be around to kind of chat after the session is over. Let's see if we can squeeze in one or two more real quick questions.
Sure.
Yeah.
Lamont Guillory with the LOR Foundation. That's LOR Foundation. The question is, we're in an audience of funders, philanthropists. What role do we play as funders? How do we contribute to the changing climate of news coverage, news media, solutions-oriented storytelling? If you could, put it back on us to figure out how we could better help you.
Well, I don't usually deal with funders.
Yeah.
And actually, solicitation is one of those things I try to avoid because of my role. I will tell you that that one of the things that I hear from a number of people that I know who work, I'll speak as an employee in public radio, and I've been working in public radio since 2004, full time. One of the things that I hear a lot of from reporters, producers, editors, and hosts in public radio is there's tons of great ideas, we just don't have the funding to do it. Like, money always becomes the drop dead. And it seems like if there's a solution, it's, I think, partly going to involve providing funds for outlets who already do great work, to have serendipity not get lost. You know, Elizabeth Gilbert in her book Big Magic talks about ideas and how she believes that ideas are living things, and they come to you for a time and they'll nag you and they'll bug you and they won't leave you alone, and if you don't listen, they vanish. And she tells a story about a story she had for a book that turned into someone else's book, and she heard the other person dictate the book to them exactly as she thought of it. And she regretted it. She said, this idea came to me first, and I let it go.
Right.
And often what happens in public media is you have station execs who have brilliant staffs with great ideas that they want to do, but because of the way that funds are restricted for certain subject areas with certain deliverables under certain periods of time, there's no room for serendipity. And stations like, say, WAMU, we have the means to begin to like build nest eggs for the future and just kind of whatever we want to create. The smaller stations, some of which depend on Corporation for Public Broadcasting funding for half of their budgets, have no budget for serendipity. There's no budget for ideas. There's only budget for execution. And there's a mismatch. Execution begins with great ideas, but execs can't do it alone. Like, they need to be able to rely on the content creators who do this all the time to say, got a great idea, it'll take this long, it'll take this many people, it'll take this many dollars. This is what I think. To give it more of an opportunity. I got this job because I worked at KQED, which had the ability, when our executive editor, Holly Kernan, said, we need to do better coverage of race that is proactive and not reactive. I want ideas. I rose my hand with an idea, it got done, and that led to me getting to Washington. If we didn't have the means, I would not be here. We can't rely on our listeners to just seed serendipity. They're paying for a lot of stations just to keep the lights on. God bless them. And they're doing a great job. But unless we create this as a competitive environment where there's room for ideation, you're never going to fund the best ideas you could fund because you won't have them. And the people who know to reach you won't have them. You've got to fund serendipity, not just established projects.
Yeah. I, by the way, know nothing about the funding of public radio, except that I know with Indivisible, we came to the end of the 100 days, and people said, well, you're going to continue this, and you know, there were plans possible to discuss doing it, but then obviously then the question is, but can we commit to do it without having the funding in hand?
Right.
That's the way it works. I mean, that's just the old story. So I'm going to go to New York tonight. I'll be with the WNYC people tomorrow. We'll talk about, so what is the next step? Where do we go and everything? And ultimately, there will be two major steps, which is, do we have a really, really good idea? And then the more important question is, and can we fund it? So, I mean, that's just the way it works, you know. And I'm not saying it's fair or unfair, but in answer to your question, a lot of these things will be determined. And to the extent that you need to do new things to address this new environment, that's where it's going to come. Somebody's going to come up with, okay, we need to address the kinds of problems we're talking about here. Here's an idea to do it. Then it's going to come down to funding. Simple as that.
I wonder if maybe by way of wrapping up, we end with Jaime-Alexis on that note in terms of new ideas, particularly new audiences. Since you deal with young people, are young people the key to this? How much do you think that kids and this next generation and the way that they engage with information could be part of the solution for elevating the dialogue in these polarized times? We'll end with you.
I think it's huge. I mean, I think if we look at the trajectory to sort of how we got to 2016 and where do we go from here, really thinking about cutting through, you know, the noise that kids are being inundated with and ensuring that they have access to quality content, that they know how to discern what quality content is. So thinking about news literacy and so forth. But I do think that they are not necessarily like a target population, but they're an engaged, curious, hungry group who want to see more and who want to get involved. And you know, there are phenomenal groups out there working with youth who could use more support from news media around driving some of these conversations. So I think that there's an opportunity certainly with young people, and you see them taking action, you know, all the time. And if we empower them with even more information, really quality storytelling, and engage them, not just with podcasts like Wow in the World, which is phenomenal, but with really solid information about what's happening in the national discourse and locally, that's really phenomenal. I was talking with someone here about a friend of mine in Oakland who just did a listening tour with Oakland youth and walked around, you know, went to all these different schools in Oakland School District and asked them, you know, what the issues that they saw that were most critical. And the number one issue were potholes. You know, and I was like, and he was like surprised, you know, that it was potholes. But there were real reasons for that because they were experiencing their community in a certain way. Are the impact of potholes for youth in Oakland getting covered in local press? I don't think so. But that's for them. That's their number one issue. And so if they don't see that and engage with that from this age, they're going to be disengaged, disenchanted, and frustrated going forward. And we lose that opportunity for a future audience.
Well, we said we could do a lot with 52 minutes, and I think with the help of Charlie Sykes and Jaime-Alexis Fowler, we certainly have. Thank you both for talking to us. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you, Joshua, for moderating such a great discussion. We're going to move into a break until around 3:10. Please get back to your seats. We'll start at 3:15 and continue this conversation over treats and desserts that are outside. So thank you.